Hello, in React, the variables and the dynamic context which will be rendered on the page continuously are managed with a state machine. So let's try to do some practice on this. I created a new page here. Let me start my application. It will be starting in my local host, so I already see the page and it is rendering now. Yes, it is ready. So I can see only the test page string here, which is just a p component with a just static string. So let's add some more context here and probably with some dynamic variables. So we can add an input field here which will let users provide their own inputs, right? So inputs should be defined like this, and we can set the value to the string. Okay, and then probably we can add a button. And finally, okay, this will be our P. So what we can do is maybe after clicking the button, we can read the input value and then transfer to the P. So we are talking about two different variables here, right? The first one is the input value. Input value, which is test page. And the next one is P value. Let's initially use empty string and then let's pass it here. Okay, when I apply, I have some errors here. What are they? Non-empty expression. Yeah, so it expects an expression here. I forget to pass the variable I defined, but I didn't pass here. So let's do that. And now if I save, I can see the webpack compiled successfully. Where is it? It is here. And I can see the input value and the button, but P I can't see anything, right? Because I set to empty string. Let's see. For example, if I put something here, I saved, and yes, I see the test string here. So when I click the button, nothing happens, right? So let's add some actions. For example, on click. So these are some different change controllers we can use. There are onClick, or there is onChange, or there is onSubmit. So let's see them one by one. Firstly, onClick. So when I click, what do I want to do? Actually, I want to change the value of this one, for example, pval. So normally this accept only a callback. So let's define a callback here. Change pval. Let's change it to some different string. So this is another string. Let's pass this callback to onClick action. Is there an issue here? That was constant, so let's replace this with let so that I can change the value. And now when I click the button, nothing changed, right? Normally what this button does is when I click on click, it calls the change p valve callback, and this callback does change the p-val. So normally p-val value is different, but it is not reflected on the application, right? So this is what we are talking about. At this point, we have to use these values with a state machine. Instead of defining them in a traditional way, what we have to do is we have to define them with some callbacks which are managing their context. So if I have input val here, I need a set input val callback to input val, and these will be using the states useState hooks. Yes, import useState from React, and I can even use the value that I want to set initially as an initial state. So useState is already imported here, very cool. And then let's do the second, which is pval. So whenever I have pval, I need set pval as well as a controller callback. This will be again using the useState hook. And now we have these values here. And since I have a callback here to set the p-value, I don't need this custom callback anymore, right? If I want to change the p-value, then I have to use this set p-val. So let's do it here. Instead of this, just set p-val. But this callback will set the context of the value of p-val, right? But set to what? So I need the input. I need an argument to call this callback. So again, I'm just calling by defining as a callback, and in this way I can use the input value that I want to use. So let's say this is another string. Okay, let's go back to the application, and then I have test page here, I have test string here. Those are the initial values, right? Initial states of our state machine. And whenever I click the button, now I can see this is another string. How it happened? When I click button, onClick action is called, and then it called the set p, which is controlling the p value, and p value was already shown in the p field. Very cool. So this is the first hook that we can see in React, which is the useState. So hooks are different built-in functions that helps us to use different features without writing classes. Because otherwise we had to write a class in which we should manage the states, the initial state, and whenever a change happens or whenever a trigger is called, we have to manage all the state transitions. But this is already a built-in function we can use, which helps us to manage the states without using or implementing any class or new algorithm from scratch. Other than this use states, there's another one which is useEffect. Whenever I start typing, I already see it here. So this hook, this is the second hook we can use. Again, use it from React. This will help me to manage some side effects. So in general, side effects are the things that are happening after I do some actions or after I go over some steps. If something else which is not in the scope of the relevant function is happening, we call them as side effects. So let's see some side effects here. For example, again, I'm using a callback here. And in side effects, I will have some dependencies. I already see it here in the definition of the function. So it will be like this. So let's say set input value. Let's use set input value to, for example, is a set as a side effect. What is happening now? Now I can see the input value as set to, this is set as a side effect, right? Let's refresh the page and try to see if it is changing from another string to this one. Actually, it's too fast, I cannot see, but what is happening here is first, as an initial state, this was set to the test page, and then this useEffect hook is called, and this value is set to, this is set as a side effect. Let's try to understand how this useEffect hook works. So I passed an empty list here, right, as a dependency list. So which means it will run only once. Whenever my application runs for the first time, this hook will run. But what if I want this to run depending on something else? For example, whenever I change the input value, let's change something on the screen. So for that, probably I can add another lock here, another P component, which might be like status, let's say. Okay. And I have to create another variable set for that, P status, and the controller, right? P status. Okay. Let's keep the number of times I change the input value. So initially, let's start with 0. And then whenever I change the input value, so input value is my dependency here. Whenever I change input value, change the status here, and change with what? Just increase the number of chains here. So let's read this and increment by 1. All right. Something like this, probably. Okay, let's see how it will look like. And of course, I want to change the input value, right? So I have to do something else here to reflect my changes to the application. So this time we can see one more action controller. The first one was onClick. The second would be what we will see here will be onChange. I already see it here. So how it will work is it will trigger an event whenever I change something. And whenever I have this change, what I want to do, I want to change or reflect this input value to be set as this variable, right? Because what the user is providing as an argument should be stored in this variable. And how can I change this variable? Just like this. To set something. No, this is the traditional way, right? So what we were doing is just instead we were using the state transition machine. So just call this one. With which value where the event was triggered from the input value, right? So the value from that field. Cool. So let's see what we have done so far. I have an input field, I have a button, I have two paragraph elements. Whenever I change the input value, it will set the user arguments, the user parameter to the input value. And whenever I change this, I have a dependency here. Whenever I change, the set status callback will be triggered, which will change the context of the p status, which is shown here. So this on this field, whenever I change, I expect some change on this p component. And what else? Whenever I click the button, I expect the change to be reflected again on the p value here. This value, this is another string value to reflect it on p value. Okay, so far let's see. Go back to the application. Okay, whenever I change, okay, I can already see the increment here, right? Whenever I change, in all my changes, this number here changes. But it doesn't change anymore unless I change this field, because it has a dependency on the input value. And whenever I change this, and whenever I click, this is another string is reflected here. But actually I want this user input to be reflected on this value, right? So what I have to do is, instead of this static string, just use the input value. All right. Okay, so far what we have seen is, we have seen the useState and the useEffect hooks and the dependencies with no dependency, which will run only once. And this will run depending on input value. And we saw the onChange here. And for button, we saw onClick. There are still some more ways to use these dependencies. For example, what happens if I totally remove this? Like this. So if I pass an empty list, it was running only once. Whenever I have some dependency list, it was running depending on the change of these values. But if I don't have any dependency list at all, even not an empty list, so it will run whenever the page is rendering. For example, let's disable this and instead use this one. So it will run after each page rendering. Let's see our application now. As we see, it is continuously changing, incrementing, because the page is continuously rendering, right? And I was trying to show the change from the initial state to this, right? So since it was too quick, we couldn't see. But what we can do is, maybe I can set a delay here with a timeout. So that's maybe we can see. Let's try. So if I, for example, use a timeout here. And let's set to 3 seconds, for example, and am I ready? I guess it is ready. Let's see. Okay, I don't even need this, just to simplify. Okay, run once with a delay, let's say. So now my application is here. Let's refresh. At first it's test page. Now it is set to this is set as a side effect after 3 seconds. If I change this to 5 seconds, then it will reflect after 5 seconds. Let's refresh test page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then this is set as a side effect. Cool. So now we solve running the useEffect hook continuously without any dependency with each time the page is rendered, and the transition from initial state to another state, which is triggered by a useEffect hook, which is running only once with an empty list dependencies. So we covered most of the things, but useState, useEffect, and onChange, onClick, but there is one more, which is onSubmit. Sometimes we fill some information and then we have to submit, right? And then some request is sent to API, or some other operations can be performed. For that, let's suppose we have a form, and in this way we can see how form is also working. So let's cover all these components with a form. And whenever I submit, let's suppose set the value of status to submitted. Set the status to submitted. Okay, and let's suppose I have another button which is submit. What was this doing? Just saving the user input, right? Okay. All right. So let's see what will happen now. Okay. My application is here. Okay, now I have two buttons, and whenever I click this, somehow the page is refreshing, right? Because since I covered all this with a form, I have to add some preventive actions here, which is, again, if there's an event here, which is like click or change or anything else, then I have to prevent those kind of page refreshes with prevent default. Okay, how about now? Okay, now page is not refreshed, and okay, the counter is still working. Whenever I do a change, it is incrementing, and whenever I click, it is reflected, the user input is saved. Everything is working, and I want submit to change The status, right? I was expecting submitted here, but again it refreshed the page. So again, I need to prevent default action here. And now, okay, this is working, and this submit didn't do what I wanted, right? I still don't see a submitted here because this time form submit is supposed to do what I want. And for that, somehow we should trigger the submit action. And for that, I don't need the button on click because I don't want the button click, but I want the form submission. So for that, I can assign the submit action to this button. Like if this button is already firing the form submission, then whenever I click this button, the form would be submitted, and on submit, the status would be set to submitted. Let's go. Okay, my increment is here. After 5 seconds, I see the change. My user is saved. Submit, and submit as well. I saw submitted, but page is refreshed. So what I need is where I'm missing this preventive action in the form itself, right? Whenever I have a change, please do not refresh the page. Okay, everything clear. Yes, this is the application that I wanted, which is showing the hooks, useState, useEffect with some dependencies, without dependencies, and some changes on the components I have on my page, like changes on the input fields, clicks on the button, and for form submissions.